There we go. So welcome everyone to the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association Interprovincial Practice Resource Launch and Overview. So today we are going to be looking at really a new resource that I've created along with the CCPA team to talk about the importance of interprovincial practice and just dealing with some of the intricacies of that. Before we jump into it today, I just want to go through our land acknowledgement. So the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association honors the sacred lands and traditional territories upon which our staff, members, advocates, and partners live, work, play, and learn. CCPA acknowledges the harm that have been done unto the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people since contact. To uphold our commitment to truth and reconciliation, we work to create equitable, meaningful, and respectful relationships with the First Nation peoples and their land by prioritizing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This public acknowledgement of traditional territories upon which we all live is an important action towards reconciliation and our commitment to continuing responding to the calls of action. So just as a note, this presentation will also be offered in French at another time. Okay, so going back to it, the things that we're going to cover today, we're first going to look at CCPA's responsibility and members' responsibility when it comes to navigating all the complexities of interprovincial practice. We're going to take a look at the new web page, and I'm going to run you through just briefly, the different areas that it covers and where you can have some of those frequently asked questions answered. We're going to look at delving into a little bit of hoping to clarify some of that complexity around the regulated versus the unregulated provinces. And then we're going to go through a couple different case studies to show how the information is going to be interpreted in different ways, depending on if you're working in a regulated versus an unregulated province. Not so much the way that the information is going to be interpreted differently, but how you're going to be required to work a little bit differently, or your follow-up is going to be a bit different depending on which province you're located, whether the client is in Canada, whether the client has started off in Canada and now is moving to another country, or if they're going to be visiting another country for a few months, that type of thing. So if you do have any questions, you can start putting them in the chat now. If you think of it as it comes up, that's kind of more my style, or you can save them to the end. I will be addressing the questions at the end. Okay, so first things first, who is responsible for what? So from our side, CCPA is here to collect the information, simplify the workload that you're already all doing such amazing jobs with day in and day out, and just present the information to you in an efficient and a legible way so that you can go in and take the time to read the information that applies to you depending on which province that you're located in, if you're regulated versus unregulated with a college, or if you're a Canadian certified counselor with the CCPA. And then it's up to you to actually go through, take the time to figure out, okay, well, what is going to work best for me? What are my requirements? And you also have to think critically about what is my ethical responsibility to this client. We're going to get a little bit more into the gray zone that comes up with that towards the end. I'd also like to share that I myself am a registered psychotherapist located in Ontario. So I'm with the CRPO. So I'm familiar with the complexities of working interprovincially as well. So next up, we're going to go through the web page itself. So let me just switch gears here. Okay, so I've stopped sharing. We're going to go back into screen share mode here. Share my screen. There we go. Okay, so with this is the new interprovincial practice page. And so we start off by just explaining, well, what is interprovincial practice? So it's the provision and administration of ethically based counseling and our psychotherapy between a practitioner and a client, where the client lives or is visiting in one province or territory or country. Also, we're going to talk about, cross-border practice, and where the practitioner is located in another province, territory, or country, right? And so with this, we're going to be looking at some of the differences between those regulated and unregulated provinces coming up. But just to go through it, what are some of the things you need to know, right? Because the path that you're going to follow is going to be different if you're in a regulated province. So our regulated provinces are Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And the unregulated provinces are all the other ones, and the territories as well, of course. So with this, it's just a little accordion drop down. You can go ahead and click on it. And so this just starts off by explaining what is a regulated practitioner. What does this mean, right? So if you reside in a regulated province and intend to provide the active counseling and or psychotherapy, you must be regulated in that province to use the restricted title of that regulatory body. So for example, for myself, using the term registered psychotherapist with the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario. In unregulated provinces or for unregulated practitioners, those are individuals who work in or live in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Newfoundland, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. So if you are practicing in one of these unregulated provinces and you're currently not a Canadian certified counselor, we definitely recommend you to go through the process of this voluntary certification, as it helps to provide the same level of protection to safety in public and also standardization across practice compared with those regulated titles in those regulated provinces. So with this, what I've learned in the past 6 months of collecting members' questions, figuring out for myself in my own private practice, and then also taking the time to put this information together, that's actually quite confusing. And so what I've taken the time to do is really boil down the information into the specific categories of the top 5 things that you need to know, and then you have to take some time looking into and exploring yourself. So those are these different categories here, right? So first up, we have the practice requirements for the client's jurisdiction. So what does that actually mean, right? So you need to see, are there any kind of rules or regulations in place around the practice of counseling or psychotherapy in the particular area where that client is living, whether that's in one of our province or territories, or whether that's in, California, Oregon, whether that's in Amsterdam, right? So we need to be checking, is that actually a regulated service? And if there is a regulated service, we need to look into, okay, well, what are the requirements of that regulatory body, the college, the group, whatever they call themselves? And then we need to make sure that the work that we're doing meets those standards and criteria, right? So very similar to looking at the standards of practice and the code of ethics for CCPA, right? So here we give a little very just brief overview of what it is you need to look at. And then we also give you a question to think about for yourself, right? So to get us started with the practice requirements for the client jurisdiction. So based on your current credentials and the practice requirements of the client's location, do you meet criteria for practice? So again, this is an example of something that you'll need to verify for yourself and that CCPA as an association is unable to answer for you. Next up, we have liability insurance. So this is the big thing, right? We need to take the time to look into what is the professional practice insurance that I have. If it's with BMS through CCPA, that's great. You're going to be covered for interprovincial practice right away. But if you have another insurance provider, you do either want to call their, check-in hotline or check the small print, or just schedule a follow-up call with that provider, a sales rep, whoever it might be, so that you can see, does that insurance provider allow you to work in a different province or country? That's the second piece. Next up is looking more at insurance, but focusing on the client side. So assessing, okay, if I'm working with a client who does have coverage through their employer, the client will need to look at their coverage to see what are the different titles that are covered for that provider, right? So this is an ongoing advocacy effort for CCPA, not just with interprovincial practice and client insurance coverage, but also with the recognition of Canadian certified counselors in unregulated provinces, and also actually the regulated titles in those regulated provinces, which is a little bit surprising. But all that to say is it's going to be really important to check the fine print, see what specific mental health practitioner titles are covered for that client's insurance. And also beyond that, if there's any geographical requirements or limitations about where the therapist is located or the practitioner and where that client is located, right? So does your client's insurance cover service if you are residing in a different province or country for the client? Another complexity that I'm seeing often from members who are sending messages in is looking at, well, if the client is away for a couple months, right? Or if I'm away for a couple months working out of my usual location, what happens then? So that's another thing we're going to get into in the case studies. So next up, virtual practice security, right? So you want to look at, okay, if you're Working interprovincially, I'm assuming you're not flying every 2 weeks to go see your client. If you are, I hope they're paying for it. That would be a great deal. But we obviously, with that, we're going to be using a platform like Zoom, Jane, Owl, Google Teams, whatever you're using, right? I'm naming off a bunch. They might not necessarily all be HIPAA compliant. So you want to make sure that the provider that you're using meets the cybersecurity and local legislation requirements for privacy and storage of personal health information. So for example, we have the Personal Health Information Protection Act in Ontario, but there's also legislation on a federal level as well. So we want to be looking for what are the legislative requirements of that client's jurisdiction, and does my virtual platform meet these requirements? A lot of the times they do, right? Because obviously if you're a provider of a virtual platform, you want to make sure that cross-provincial ability is there, right? But just something extra to double check. Really make sure that you just cross all of your T's and dot all your I's. And then lastly, so this is more, these first 4 steps that we have here, this is really focusing on kind of like the more that administrative side of practice, but then we want to look at supervision as well, right? So if you're currently qualifying or you're a student, right, you want to look for, if you're under supervision, like you need to make sure that you're letting your supervisor know, discuss any potential concerns, and just make sure that they're on board with this in terms of the specific population that you work with, right? So if you're working with someone who has recently moved to a different province and you're not able to support them locally, or if they're moved to a more remote area, but they are at high risk, right? You really want to look into, how is my safety plan going to be different? What extra steps do I need to put in place to ensure that that client is getting the support that they need, especially if a crisis were to happen, right? Working virtually, whether you're interprovincial or not, when it comes to safety planning, is going to be a lot different than if you're able to see someone in person, right? So these are the main categories that we want to look at for just considering making sure that we have all of our ducks in a row, so to speak. Next up, we have taken the time to pull the information from the 5 different colleges that we have from those regulated provinces. And if you just click through, you'll see information that you need, specifically what that particular college says about interprovincial practice. So for this, we really just kind of given the credit where it's due, make sure we're not plagiarizing, but copy and pasting from those different bodies so that you know it's the correct information. The only exception where we weren't able to copy and paste is for l'Ordre des Psychologues de Québec. So the order of psychologists under which psychotherapists fall in Quebec. So for this, we weren't able to find the information on their website. So this is the information that we collected from a meeting with them. So if you do have questions specifically pertaining to Quebec, please do call the OPQ directly. They're super friendly, and also they're able to communicate in both official languages, no problem. So next up, we wanted to talk just a little bit about BMS Insurance. So this is our choice insurance providers, and they advise each professional to talk to their relevant regulatory bodies, make sure that they can practice. BMS is specifically Canada-wide. So if you're not seeing clients outside of Canada, you're not covered. If you decide to counsel people in other provinces, you need to make sure of just, the steps that are outlined above. So this is the information that we received from BMS. But if you do have BMS coverage, you are covered for you are covered from that insurance perspective for that additional practice. It is always good practice though to double check and make sure that that everything is clear and that you're aware of the scope of this practice. Next, we wanted to look at regulated versus unregulated provinces. So this is where some of more of the complexity comes in. To get us started here, we're looking at this graph of Canada. And so on the eastern side, we have most of the provinces regulated with the orange and the reds. And then on the western side, we have mostly blue. So those are the unregulated provinces, with the exception of Alberta. So Alberta is a little bit of an in-between province right now. So they've started the process of legislating psychotherapy. So we also have Alberta, which is a little bit in between. So they started to go through the process of becoming regulated, but the colleges hasn't opened yet. So that's why we're still considering it as an unregulated province. If you want more information about what's happening with regulation in each province right now, you can go ahead to the website below. So that's our profession regulation tab under our advocacy and regulation tab on the main page of the CCPA website. And when you scroll down, you'll be able to see the same graph. And then with that, you can actually click on each individual province to see where that province is at with regulation right now. So following that, we have some of the case studies that we are talking about. And so with this, just switch screens, there we go. And so here are some different examples of some frequently asked questions I've been getting from members over the past 6 months. So for the first case we're looking at, let's say I was a therapist in BC, which is an unregulated province, and I'm working with a client who's located in Ontario. So if I'm working in BC and I'm seeing a client that's in Ontario who's just reached out to me, what I would have to do is to check in with the CRPO in Ontario to see what the requirements are there to be able to become regulated with the province of Ontario to be able to work with them. The reason for this is because BC is not regulated. They don't have that regulatory body as that comparison. And so what the reason why you'd have to get maybe, let's say, a temporary permit or to become registered with them is to ensure that safety to the public. Next up, let's say I was a therapist in Nova Scotia, which is regulated. I want to see a client in Saskatchewan, which is an unregulated province. In this case, there would be no issue because I'm in a regulated province. This supersedes the requirements for the unregulated province because there are no requirements to practice mental health counseling, or psychotherapy. And so I'd be able to go ahead working with that client. Of course, if the client had insurance coverage and the insurance coverage said it was fine for them to work with someone out of province. And of course, if my insurance allowed for interprovincial practice. The next up is a cross-border situation, which I've seen a few times now in the past couple months. So let's say that I'm working in a regulated province like New Brunswick, and I have a client reach out to me who I haven't started working with yet from California. So in this case, in California, they have the California Counseling Association. What I have to do is let the client know that I have to look into this to ensure that I'm able to practice with them based off of the local requirements of the area that they work in. And then I'd have to go ahead and reach out to the CCA and to see what the requirements are for me to work with a client in their state, whether that might look like a temporary permit or maybe it's just a comparison of criteria. There's different ways to find out this information. Either you can just do a Google search and check the website. In certain cases, you might have to just give a telephone call to their registrar office or equivalent, because sometimes these cases are pretty individualized and pretty complex. And so it's just going to be easiest to, after checking those 5 points that we went through on the resource page, to also come back and to do a bit of extra digging by reaching out to the association directly. So these are the common cases that we see. The other thing I did say I was going to mention about was, let's say if you're going to be out of province or out of your normal location for a short amount of time, or vice versa, if the client is going to be doing that. Again, this really comes down to, this is one of the situations where the CCPA is here to provide you with the necessary information, but it's your responsibility as a practitioner to use your clinical judgment, use your best practice judgment, think about your ethical requirements, think about, what's going to work or what doesn't work for you in your practice, and just make sure that your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed in terms of insurance, jurisdiction, and that type of thing. So with that, if you have any questions, or would like some additional support, or also if you have some feedback, right? There's something that you think is missing, or you'd like to see some adjustments made, please do go ahead and send me an email. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible, and we'll see where we go from there. So thank you so much for taking the time today to join in on our new launch of our Interprovincial Practice resource. And again, all the resources are available in English and in French. Thanks for your time. I hope this was helpful. Talk to you soon.